Yes.
Okay, it's recording now.
So dear all, on behalf of the Center for Advanced Study of Religion at MF or MF CASR, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to today's lecture. My name is Ingeborg, and I am the director of the center. So the event is the result of a cooperation between the Critical Islamic Studies Research Group and its leader, Sami Al-Daghistani, and MF CASR. And it's indeed an honor to welcome Professor Megan B. Abbas and Verena Meyer to our online space. So I'll leave the floor to Sami Al-Daghistani, who will present our distinguished lecturer and also lead today's event. Please.
Thank you, Liv, for your kind introduction and also for hosting us again. And to Greg for his help. He's a fellow colleague and a technician behind the scenes, so to speak. So welcome everyone to our Critical Islamic Studies webinar. We're very happy to have Professor Megan Abbas and Dr. Verena Meyer with us today. Just a few words about Critical Islamic Studies, which is a research group at MF whose aims are to engage with both historical and modern analysis of and research in the field of Islamic studies. One of the aims of the research group is to interrogate the nature and the boundaries of the field and to deconstruct hegemonic discourses and historical processes of Eurocentrism. Professor Abbas will discuss a very important topic, not only for Islamic studies, but for the field of religious studies as well, more generally, namely the insider-outsider or the ethic-emic distinctions in Islam. Megan Abbas is an associate professor at Colgate University. She studies modern Islamic intellectual history and the complex encounters between Western imperialism and Muslim communities, especially in Indonesia. Her first book, Who's Islam? The Western University and Modern Islamic Thought in Indonesia, repositions Western universities as a significant spaces for producing Islamic knowledge and Muslim religious authority in the 20th and 21st centuries. By tracing the many entanglements between Western academia and Indonesian Islam, Abbas uncovers the far-reaching repercussions these networks have had on the world's most populous Muslim nation, as well as on Islamic studies as an academic discipline. At Colgate, Professor Abbas teaches a range of Islamic studies courses, as well as classes on contemporary religion, secularism, and Indonesia. Dr. Verena Meyer is an incoming assistant professor in Islam in South and Southeast Asia at Leiden University. Dr. Meyer received her PhD at the Department of Religion at Columbia University, where she was an early career fellow, and until recently, she was a postdoctoral fellow in Islamic studies at MF. Trained in Islamic studies and specializing in Islam in Indonesia, her research focuses on the ways in which traditionalist and modernist Javanese Muslims construct and maintain their group identities through memory practices of authority founding figures and by appropriating canonical texts in Arabic, Indonesian, and Javanese. A warm welcome to both of you again. So Professor Abbas will speak for approximately 30 minutes, and then Verena and I will ask a few questions, after which we will take a few more questions from the audience. And if you're following us online, and if you would like to contribute a question, you can do so by writing your comment or your question along with your name in the Q&A function. Now I would like to hand it over to Professor Abbas.
Oh, thank you for that introduction. Thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to join you all virtually, coming from my kitchen right now. So let me yank up my PowerPoint and dive in. Here we go, share screen. Okay, and everyone sees that, right?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. Okay, so this is part of a long-term interest that I've had in insider-outsider dynamics in Islamic studies. As Sami just mentioned, my first book, Who's Islam, engages with and investigates the entanglements between the Western universities and modern Islamic thought in Indonesia in particular, and looks at the ways that 50 plus years of exchange programs have really challenged what it means, in my mind, to be an academic and what it also means to be a Muslim scholar, and seeing the kind of intertwining of those two modes of authority and two modes of credentials. What I'm going to present today moves beyond my first book. It's a draft chapter for an edited volume entitled Conceptualizing Islam that largely revolves around Shah Ahmed's book, What is Islam? This presentation will decenter Ahmed a little bit in comparison to the chapter itself, since I'm assuming that people might not have Shah Ahmed's book front and center in their mind, and also in order to highlight the two Indonesian cases that I really want to speak about in some depth and use as a way of reflecting about the emek-etic or the insider-outsider distinction that prevails often in Islamic studies and religious studies more generally. Okay, so I'm just going to dive straight in now. In 1964, Marvin Harris introduced the emek-etic distinction to the field of anthropology, and by extension to Islamic and religious studies as well. While the term's exact meanings are subject to debate, most scholars would agree that emek research seeks to reconstruct how social actors understand their interests, motives, and behaviors within their own contextual web of meaning. In other words, the emek inhabits and articulates a particular insider religious perspective on the world. Etic scholarship, in contrast, seeks to transcend particular cultural perspectives in order to develop generalized theories to explain human behavior. Accordingly, the etic researcher is not beholden to emek accounts, but rather works among and for fellow academics. Although anthropologists began to dismantle the emek-etic distinction in the late 20th century, its assumptions remain relevant to the contemporary study of religion, and especially Islam, in the Western Academy. In Islamic studies, the distinction became entangled in long-running debates over the status of Muslim insider, or emek, versus academic outsider, or etic, forms of knowledge. I want to take a second here and acknowledge that the emek-etic and insider-outsider distinctions are not exactly the same distinction. The emek-etic distinction focuses on the nature of research and the goals of research itself, with emek research trying to reconstruct an insider's worldview, etic research taking a kind of outsider's analytical position. In contrast, the insider-outsider distinction really kind of gets at the heart of the identity of the researcher, people who identify as insiders or kind of members of the religious group under investigation versus people who identify as outside that group. However, even though one is about the nature of research and one is about the identity of research, these two binaries often kind of get intertwined or kind of used interchangeably. And in Shah Ahmed's book, which the article, the chapter I'm presenting from is really based on, he uses them interchangeably. So I will generally as well in this presentation, although I'm more than happy to talk about the ways that those two distinctions are in some ways distinct. The emek-etic distinction also raises fundamental questions about how scholars conceptualize Islam. Specifically, can we classify definitions of Islam as either emek or etic in nature? If so, then what constitutes a properly etic conceptualization? If not, then what does the inability to distinguish between the emek and etic mean for Islamic studies? Today, I want to tell the story of two academic conceptualizations of Islam and how they inspired Indonesian Muslim intellectuals to reimagine Islam in the sprawling archipelago nation. Following J.L. Austin, I will use performativity to refer to the ability of words not merely to describe the world as it is, but to perform an action in and hence alter that very world. Some words, quote, do things. Wael Halak builds on this Austinian insight to argue that Islamic studies has, for centuries, played a central role in, quote, the remolding, refashioning, and in short, recreation of Muslim subjectivities, end quote. According to Halak, colonial and post-colonial geopolitics have enabled this performativity. Drawing on Austin and Halak, I argue that all efforts to define Islam carry both performative potential and normative force. Accordingly, academics do not merely describe or conceptualize Islam as it supposedly is. We, quote, do things to Islam, to Muslims, and to the complex and interconnected world in which we all live. So my first case comes from the mid-20th century and follows the ways that a British Orientalist definition of Islam has impacted and inspired a major Islamic politician and intellectual in mid-20th century Indonesia. H.A.R. Gibb was a towering figure in the mid-20th century academic study of Islam. Educated in Edinburgh and in London, he taught first at the School of Oriental and African Studies, or SOAS, and then at Oxford University for nearly 40 years. In 1955, he relocated to the United States to run Harvard University's then new Center for Middle Eastern Studies. Gibb specialized in medieval Arab history, but he also published popular introductions to Islam and politics. In his 1932 introduction to Islam, entitled Whither Islam, he offered a definition of Islam as an object of study. He wrote, "Islam is indeed much more than a system of theology. It is a complete civilization. If we were to seek for parallel terms, we should use Christendom rather than Christianity, China rather than Confucianism. It includes a whole complex of cultures which have grown up around the religious core, or have, in most cases, been linked onto it with more or less modification, a complex with distinctive features in political, social, and economic structure, in its conception of law, in ethical outlook, intellectual tendencies, and habits of thought and action." With this definition, Gibb sought to overturn conceptualizations of Islam as merely a religion, in, quote, the modern, detached, and private sense of the word world. He saw Islam as much more than that. It was a complete civilization that produced, in his words, its own political, social, and economic structures and shaped, quote, every aspect of Muslim life. Gibb was neither the first nor the last Western scholar to advance such an essentialist civilizational conception of Islam, but I want to kind of build on his and see how it influences scholars in Indonesia. So moving to Indonesia. Muhammad Natsir represents an early and important case of transgressing the emic-etic divide. Born in West Sumatra in 1908, Natsir received a predominantly Dutch-style education in his youth, but he also cultivated an early commitment to Indonesia's twin movements of Islamic reformism and Islamic nationalism. Once Indonesia declared its independence in 1945, Natsir quickly rose through the ranks of the new revolutionary leadership. He served as the fledgling Republic's communication minister for more than 3 years and became the national chairman of Masumi, the country's largest Islamic political party. He also served briefly as prime minister in 1950 to 1951. Simply put, Natsir was arguably the country's most prominent Islamic politician in the 1950s and early 1960s. Like many of his contemporaries, Natsir was well-versed in both the Islamic and Western intellectual traditions, and often integrated Western sources into his writings on Indonesian Islamic politics. He repeatedly drew on Gibb's conceptualization in particular to argue for a more expansive scope for Islam. For example, in the late 1930s, he wrote a series of essays on, quote, Islam and civilization, that lauded the scientific and philosophical achievements of great medieval Islamic thinkers as equal to, if not surpassing, those of their modern Western counterparts. Natsir tried to use these medieval figures to persuade his fellow Muslims to eschew their intellectual loyalty to the West and celebrate their Islamic civilizational heritage instead. He introduced this series of essays by quoting, in both the original English and translated Indonesian, Gibb's definition. Quote, Islam is indeed more than a system of theology. It is a complete civilization, end quote. Natsir presented the quote as evidence that Islam encompassed not only personal belief and worship, but also philosophy, psychology, medical sciences, and a general commitment to reason. He also praised the quote's author, Gibb, for his objectivity in recognizing Islam's contributions to civilization. In the introductory essay, Natsir described Gibb, quote, as a great scholar of history, uninfluenced by feelings of religious fanaticism and free of zealotry. And in another essay, he characterized Gibb as, quote, an Orientalist with the right to issue a judgment on these matters. According to Natsier, Gibbs' position as an academic outsider rendered his expansive definition more authoritative because Gibbs was supposedly neutral and hence untainted by the intra-Muslim politics raging in 1930s Indonesia. This appearance of outsider or etic objectivity thus enabled Gibbs' conceptualization to mold Indonesian Muslims' insider or emic understanding of Islam. Natsier turned yet again to Gibbs' definition in the early 1950s. Here I want to talk about this pamphlet in a bit of depth. During his political heyday, Natsier wrote an essay entitled Islam as an Ideology that eventually became the unofficial platform for the Masumi Party, which, as I had mentioned earlier, was the largest Islamic party in Indonesia in the 1950s. The essay pushed back against popular secularist conceptualizations of Islam as a narrow, personal, and apolitical religion, and insisted instead that Islam had a crucial role to play in the nascent Indonesian state. Natsier wielded Gibbs' definition to support his position. The essay's second paragraph read, "People usually conceptualize the term religion as referring only to a system of worship between God and his creation. Perhaps this definition is appropriate for many religions. However, Islam is obviously much more than that. Islam involves regulations for how humans should behave towards other humans as fellow creations of God. If we borrow the words of the Western Orientalist H.A.R. Gibb, then we can conclude in one sentence, quote, Islam is much more than a religious system, it is a complete civilization. Islam is a life philosophy or an ideology. It is a behavioral system in addition to an ideology and an ism. This ideology serves as a compass for us Muslims, and as a result, we cannot separate it from politics." In other words, Natsier wanted Indonesian Muslims to conceptualize Islam not merely as a private religion, but as a potent social and political force. He elaborated on this vision throughout the essay. He explained that while neither the Quran nor the Sunnah mandated that Muslims establish a caliphate or any other particular form of government, they did outline foundational principles for Islamic political and social ethics. He cited prohibitions on alcohol and gambling and mandated charitable redistribution as examples. These political and social regulations were, according to Natsier, integral parts of Islam itself. Gibbs' definition thus helped Natsier to persuade Indonesian Muslims to adopt a more expansive and politicized conceptualization of Islam. Overall, Gibbs' definition of Islam was not simply descriptive. Rather, it, quote, did something to Natsier, Masumi, and Indonesian Islamic politics in the 1950s. It was thus performative in nature, despite, or sometimes because of, presumptions about Gibbs' objectivity. This performativity raises questions about the emic-etic distinction. Specifically, how exactly should we classify the nature of Gibbs' definition? Was it an outsider or etic definition when Gibbs wrote it, but an insider or emic definition when Natsier deployed it? Did it somehow retain its etic origins regardless of its later use? Or was it never actually etic because it always carried that performative potential? I want to now move quite far ahead chronologically until the recent last decade or so, and focus on Shahab Ahmed's book itself, his redefinition of Islam, and then the way that Indonesian Muslims, or at least one Indonesian Muslim, has engaged with his redefinition of Islam. In 2016, Shahab Ahmed published What is Islam?, a wide-ranging and meticulous work that sought to define Islam in academic scholarly discourse. Despite the book's many strengths, Ahmed embraces the emic-etic distinction, and moreover seems to presume that only emic or insider scholarship molds Islam. He articulates this distinction in the opening paragraph of his very first chapter. I am seeking to say the word Islam in a manner that expresses the historical and human phenomenon that is Islam in its plenitude and complexity of meaning, he wrote. In conceptualizing Islam as a human and historical phenomenon, I am precisely not seeking to tell the reader what Islam is as a matter of divine command, and thus am not seeking to prescribe how Islam should be followed as the means to existential salvation. If I hold out a selfific prospect, it is the altogether more modest, but perhaps no less elusive one of analytical clarity. With this introductory statement of intent, Ahmed seeks to position himself as an academic outsider. He first declares his exclusive interest in, quote, the historical and human phenomenon of Islam, and then actively disavows, through a repeated use of italics in this passage, any desire to engage in either metaphysical speculation or prescriptive theology. Indeed, he denies that the book carries any normative message for Muslims at all. Ahmed stresses his position as a disinterested etic theorist again in the conclusion, when he writes, quote, the conceptualization that I have presented is external, etic, to the human and historical phenomenon at stake, in that it does not privilege any single self-designation of Islam, end quote. Overall, Ahmed, apparently concerned with being misunderstood, repeatedly insists that his research is neutral, analytic, and etic in nature. However, just like Gibbs' work, What is Islam carries its own performative force. Among the first Indonesians to engage publicly with Ahmed's book was the octogenarian poet-journalist Gunawan Muhammad. Muhammad is arguably Indonesia's most celebrated journalist. In the 1970s, he co-founded the country's premier weekly news magazine, Tempo, and served for decades as its editor-in-chief. Under his leadership, Tempo earned accolades for its hard-hitting exposés of corruption, as well as its consistent support for a tolerant and liberal Islam. He has also written hundreds of sophisticated opinion editorials that weave together a diverse range of philosophical and literary traditions to reflect on contemporary events. He often quotes from everyone from Adorno to the Mahabharata in these op-eds. They're very wide-ranging and really interesting. On June 27th, 2019, Gunawan Muhammad dedicated his weekly column to Ahmed's book. He wrote, although he does not mention the Islamic heritage of Southeast Asia, Ahmed tries to demonstrate something that concerns us all. When discussing Islam, a Muslim need not banish contradictions within Islam itself. Muhammad elaborated by explaining that, quote, Islam is expansive in terms of geography, history, language, and meaning. It therefore encompasses great medieval poets, philosophers, and artists, despite repeated efforts among Orthodox Muslim authorities to marginalize and even denounce their contributions to the Islamic tradition. While he manages to capture the heart of Ahmed's argument succinctly for his popular Indonesian audience, Gunawan Muhammad does not read the book as advancing solely an etic theory about Islam. Instead, he interprets the argument as a rebuke to rigid Islamic identity politics. He muses, there is anxiety about the unfinished. In order to cope with anxiety about ambiguity, religion becomes a social political construction. And with the impact of colonialism since the 18th century, that construction becomes identity. We know that identity is formulated to mark that, quote, we are Muslim. It is a collective identity card. However, like identity cards, it simplifies what it marks. When religion becomes an identity, humanity walks as if half dreaming, a dream about unity that is never achieved, and a frustration due to differences that are considered frightening. With these rather indirect words, Gunawan Muhammad laments how social, political, and spiritual anxieties drove Muslims to reduce Islam's great expansiveness into a mere identitarian label. He blames this simplified us versus them framework for fueling the fear-based politics of Islamic parties, protests, and pandering in contemporary Indonesia. However, his critique does not stop there. Taking inspiration again from Shahab Ahmed, Gunawam Muhammad insists that narrowing Islam from its expansive, exploratory medieval manifestations to a flat modern identity has left modern Muslims adrift in today's world. Although Muhammad celebrates the political and spiritual significance of his work, Shahab Ahmed repeatedly tries to forestall such normative readings. He includes several mitigating statements of authorial intent in the conclusion to reiterate his statement of intent at the beginning of the book. For example, Ahmed denies nostalgia for the medieval Islamic past, writing, "Despite my efforts to elucidate the complexity and richness of pre-modern Islam, mine is not an agenda of nostalgia. This is certainly not to say that I reject nostalgia out of hand as a valid and instructive value. We should not dismiss outright the possibility that some things about the good old days might indeed have been good. But to read this book as a thesis of nostalgia is to have it argue for the positive value of such pre-modern norms and practices of hierarchy as gender inequality and slavery, which I really am not doing." Of course, there's little to no evidence that Ahmed is blindly nostalgic for all aspects of pre-modern Islam, yet his response turns any nostalgic interpretation into a straw man that is easily dismissed, rather than considering the far more reasonable reading that the book is selectively nostalgic for the Sufi-oriented philosophical and artistic Islam of the medieval era. Muhammad certainly reads Ahmed as harboring such a selective nostalgia, and he has good reasons for doing so. Shahab Ahmed uses negative and even melancholic language. He uses the words disruption, destruction, effectively fractured, considerably depleted, largely lost, downsizing, extremely impoverished, diminished, to describe the modern displacement of pre-modern Islam. Reflecting on the impact of print technologies, he writes that they, quote, led modern Muslims not to an increasingly rich inner landscape, but to a poorer one. He likewise despairs that modern Muslim engagements with Persian language, philosophical, and Sufi discourse has, quote, shrunk like the Oral Sea, leaving behind only the dusty traces of its former depth and fertility. If these are not appeals to try to recapture the expansive and even contradictory nature of medieval Islam, then I'm not sure what they are. Ahmed also tries to prevent any overtly political readings of his book. In the conclusion, he distances his work from those that endorse a, quote, moderate Islam, and warns that the emphasis in this book on the Sufi philosophical amalgam or on the Mahad Ishq, the school of love, should not be misconstrued as an attempt to present what, in contemporary discourse of relations between Muslims and the West, is often called the soft face of Islam. To the contrary, I have no interest in peddling an over-irenic picture of Islam or of Muslims to the West, or for that matter, to Muslims. I grant that Ahmed never tries to deny that Wahhabism, Salafism, or even violent jihadism fall under the banner of Islam. It is nevertheless logical for Gunawam Muhammad to see Ahmed as a fellow proponent of a tolerant liberal Islam. To take Ahmed's remarks about Wahhabism as an important example. He devotes the final few pages of the book to dissecting what he calls Wahhabism's hostility to the philosophical Sufi amalgam and its disregard, quote, if not contempt, for the history of Muslims other than the modular earlier community and of the Wahhabis themselves. Ahmed includes 4 photos of what he calls, quote, the modern destruction of Mecca and Medina, and, quote, wonders if the relative indifference to how modern Muslims have accepted the physical destruction of the 2 most symbolically and ritually meaningful cities of Islam suggests the degree to which the vision of Wahhabism is not merely a cause, but also, quote, a symptom of the broader condition of the Islamic modern. His use of symptom here hints at an underlying belief that the Wahhabi-inspired Islamic modern is diseased, or even, as he gestures elsewhere, calamitous for the Islamic tradition. Overall, the book privileges the complexity and expansiveness of philosophical and Sufi worldviews over their, quote, diminished Wahhabi and Salafi style counterparts. Gunawam Muhammad sees these underlying commitments clearly, even if Ahmed often tries to obscure them in the language of etic theory and academic objectivity. In the end, Ahmed's statements of authorial intent do not and cannot negate the performative force of his argument. No writer nor reader works in a vacuum. Arguments inevitably contribute to ongoing context-driven conversations, whether an author intends to or not. I want to underscore that. A lot of my argument here hinges on not what Shahab Ahmed's intentions are. I leave that very much to him to decide, but what force his arguments have and how people can use his arguments. In our post 9/11 world, Ahmed's argument for a more expansive definition of Islam is nostalgic and is political. Although he tries to deny these attributes and even at times to blame his readers for noticing that they are there, he cannot mask the argument's normative underpinnings and performative potential. While the second half of my presentation has focused on Ahmed, my argument seeks neither to diminish his book's many achievements nor to single him out for special critique. On the contrary, I maintain that all academic conceptualizations of Islam are both normative and performative in nature. This statement holds equally true for Ahmed, for Marshall Hodgson, whom I analyze in a longer version of this chapter, and H.A.R. Gibbs' conceptualizations. For me, these case studies demonstrate that the emic-etic distinction is unstable at best and intellectually untenable at worst. We cannot simply ignore or wish away decades of cross-discursive entanglements in Indonesia and elsewhere. Rather, Western and Western-based academics must accept that even our supposedly etic conceptualizations do things to modern Islamic thought. We need not try in vain to mitigate or deny these dynamics, but must instead acknowledge and learn how to navigate them. Okay, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Abbas, for your talk and presentation, also for sharing your paper with us.
Yeah.
I think your topic is highly valuable, not only for the type of work and research that we do here at our research group, but I think has repercussions for both Islamic studies and more broadly religious studies, both fields, in that it brings into question a lot of the pre-established or predetermined structures and biases, obviously, about how to do, as you say, or how to study Islam specifically, but also religion more generally. Before I turn to Dr. Meyer, I would like to ask the following question just to get us started. Your work intervenes in the long-established tradition of, again, both religious and Islamic studies, and you critically engage with the ethic-emic distinction, asking what exactly constitutes this distinction or dichotomy, and by whom it is constituted, right? And this raises key questions about how scholars think about Islam as a tradition, if we put it simply, both from Muslim majority countries and from Euro-America. And you showcased a few examples, not least from Indonesia, how Muslim scholars trained and educated in both, again, Muslim and Western settings, reappropriate a particular narrative, a particular vision of Islam. But I'm also interested in hearing how does this distinction manifest or play out the other way around, as in what impact, if any, scholars in Muslim majority countries had, exactly because of their experience, on Western scholars, and specifically on those Western scholars who thoroughly believe in this absolute objectivity of their projects, while, discrediting other types of work or scholarship based on the idea that it brings into ethical, metaphysical interventions and so on and so forth. So thinking along with Nasir or Majid or Muhammad, were their definitions of Islam referenced in North American settings, given the fact that some of them are graduates from North American universities?
Yeah. So really important and big question. I want to answer this maybe in two different ways. So the first, I think, is very clear that the citation patterns generally flow the other way, given the kind of authority and assumptions about objectivity that Western scholars enjoy, especially in the 20th century, that it's much more frequent that you have Muslim intellectuals who are going to be quoting from Western scholars in order to use their theories and frameworks and definitions than the other way around. However, that's not to say that there aren't Western scholars who do the reverse, especially as part of their research. So when I think of examples of how Western scholars, specifically those working in Indonesia, are thinking about how Muslims define Islam in particular, the first person that comes to my mind is Clifford Geertz, definitely, and the reliance on what we would call Muslim modernist definitions of what Islam is to define the tradition. So Geertz, in his famous 1960 book, The Religion of Java, really kind of assumes to a large degree that the santri tradition is the kind of real Islam in Indonesia, that the more synchronistic Priyayi, as he calls it, or Banganan traditions are less Islamic in nature. So we can see this really occurring throughout the mid-20th century, that Indonesian anthropologists and historians would go to Indonesia in a lot of ways hang out with or kind of form friendships or working partnerships with modernist Muslims, and then really rely on their definitions of what Indonesian Islam is, what Islam itself is, in order to write their scholarship. So I do think it does go the other way sometimes, but more in the form of fieldwork itself, rather than the explicit kind of quoting of certain definitions or theoretical frameworks.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Dr. Meyer.
Yes. Thank you so much, Megan, for this wonderful talk. I was so struck by that Gunawan Muhammad's engagement with Shab Ahmed. I had no idea that this was happening. That's so fascinating. But I have a different question. So I'm wondering if we, as scholars, accept that this divide between the emic and the etic is, this is kind of a binary of convenience. It's constructed. It doesn't have any inherent meaning. And if we also accept that whatever we do is normative in some way, right? So where does this leave us as we enter this academic performance? So we're stepping on the stage and we're making some sort of statement, we're producing some sort of scholarship. But at the same time, we know that whatever we say is going to be interpreted through the lens of whatever dominant culture there is. So let's say that I want to make an intervention that really kind of goes against the cultural mainstream right now. How do I do that?
Yeah.
This is also a slightly unfair question. I'm sorry about that.
No, totally fair. And I will just begin this by, despite having been thinking about this, I want to say for like almost a decade, I really am not sure about the answer to this question. A couple of ways that I think about this. One, I think at the end of the day, the emic, etic, or insider-outsider distinctions to me are really about audience. They're not about the nature of what you are doing. They're more about who you think you're talking to and who you want to intervene into. So when I kind of think about this way of saying, well, who is this argument aimed for? What is the goal behind the argument you are making? And to really kind of think through, and I think that's what I'm trying to learn how to do and trying to, speak to other people about, of how do we kind of think about the stakes behind what we're doing in a more explicit way, rather than just leaving it at the analytical argument, but thinking about why am I making this argument? Why am I making this argument now? What impact do I want to have with this argument? And thinking through really those questions, because I personally find as obviously this presentation gets into the distinction that an argument itself is emic or etic in nature really just doesn't hold when arguments move and are reinterpreted and reappropriated and already have those kind of resources within them. So to me, I think it's about who and why you're making an argument. So that all being said, at the end of the day, I also don't think it's avoidable. Like I'm not necessarily making an argument here that says that we should try to prevent arguments from moving. I think it's really cool that they move. I think it unifies us. It brings us together on Zoom and interesting conferences. But to be aware that that's going to be, that will happen, and that we should be thinking about, as much as possible, how to kind of predict what will happen, and think about that as part of the production of scholarship itself. The fact that, Indonesian scholars are going to be quoting from, using scholarship that we produce here and vice versa to some degree, is no longer something that should be like surprising or some kind of curiosity that occurs, but it's incredibly normal and regular. I did not start off this chapter project with the knowledge that Gunawan Muhammad had used Shahab Ahmed's book. I assumed that someone had used his book at some point. I found multiple different people in Indonesia who were writing in Indonesian who had been quoting Shahab Ahmed's work. Gunawan Muhammad just happens to be the one with the biggest platform. So the man I went with, the scholar that I went with for the chapter. But I think that we should just be making assumptions that is what's going to be happening, and should not be trying to kind of deny that our arguments can be read that way. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If I may go back to the notion of performativity, and it seems that that's one solution out of this sort of structural dichotomy, right? And part of your paper focuses on that. Performativity in the sense that all of us write or produce or discuss issues within the field, and obviously do not work in a vacuum, but we add to the existing, both past and future scholarship on Islam and Muslims, right? If we co-create then, let's say, discourses about Islam and the Muslim world, are you saying that it's not only performances of faith that are directly sort of linked into the aspects of people worship, but also on the scholarly level, by writing, by producing, scholars, white or not, Muslim or non-Muslim, engage in performativity of the field, right? So if I understood correctly, how is scholars' performativity different, epistemologically speaking, from believers' performativity when it comes to the fields of Islamic studies, right? Because what you're pointing out, it's obviously the fact that, well, the two are interlinked. But if I understood that correctly, maybe you can just break down this one.
Sure.
Thank you.
So I'm predominantly thinking about the term performativity here in terms of definitions. So if we think about this kind of ongoing debate in Islamic studies of how do we define what Islam is, and this attempt by academic scholars to say, I'm not interested in saying that this is what Islam should be. I'm just describing what Islam is. I'm just trying to capture what it is. So this attempt to have this kind of etic definition. So my argument is that etic definition in a lot of ways makes what Islam is. So if you're going to write a massive book coming out of Harvard or coming out of Oxford for Gibb, and you're going to create a definition of Islam, inevitably Muslims and non-Muslims alike are going to take that definition rather seriously and start saying, okay, this is a useful definition of what Islam is. So it actually ends up not just kind of describing how Islam functions in the world, it ends up defining what Islam should be, even if that's not the intention behind it. And I think, to me, that issue of intention is perhaps the way I begin to make a distinction between insiders and outsiders. I don't think that we should entirely do away with the distinction. Of course, people are coming from different positions, different goals in their scholarship, and we need to kind of recognize that. And I think that part of what that has to do with is that the intention behind the scholarship might be different, right? We can think about Islamic modernists like Fazlur Rahman, who are, going to work at the University of Chicago with the intention of reforming the Islamic tradition. A lot of, non-Muslim historians do not necessarily go into a project thinking that they are going to contribute to an Islamic reformist endeavor, but that doesn't mean that what they're producing does not have the potential to do that, does not have the kind of normative assumptions built into it that it could do that. So when I think that there is a distinction, I don't want to entirely collapse the distinction between insider and outsider. Like, people come with different assumptions, different faith backgrounds, for different goals in when they write. But I don't think that that necessarily means that what they have written cannot be interpreted in a very valid way to define what Islam should be, even if the goal was not to say what Islam should be. But when you offer a definition implies a should in it. And I would say basically any definition does that. If we start defining what democracy is, then we are inevitably saying this is what democracy should be when we do that. So to me, that's really how I'm trying to think about the performativity piece, is instead of thinking about definitions, these kind of like large scale frameworks as describing, analyzing, they have a should baked in them from the beginning.
Okay, I see. Thanks for clarifying this. Before going back to Dr. Meyer, Liv, do you have a question perhaps yourself?
Yeah, I do. Thank you so much for this very interesting lecture. I have many questions, but I'll ask one first.
Sure.
So I'm thinking about this issue about insiders and outsiders and ethic amic, and also this notion that many of us grew up with, kind of that, like, if you were an historian of religion, you were supposed to be neutral and descriptive and so on. And then I'm thinking about well, one of the major discussions right now in the field of history of religions, largely perceived, is the role of what one side would call activism and what the other side would call like social engagement and so on. So, and that is like, it's one of the major issues, for instance, in the International Association for the History of Religions at the moment. So it's like really one of those dividing things, and there are like strong emotions involved here. And I would love to hear you think about how you think that might influence our discourses or discussions about these issues, because this is another way of like introducing normativity, if you like. So please, I would love to hear what you think about this.
Yeah, really interesting. So so I'm also trained as a historian. So part of my first book really goes and looks back until the immediate post-World War II era and sees the persistent presence of social engagement activist agendas, or that has a really negative ring to it. So let's just say social engagement or activism in general in Islamic studies in the West. You can see from the late 1940s on a real effort among Islamic studies scholars to see that they are part of a move to help certain Muslim scholars reform the tradition in a direction that they want to see go. So I think that my first reaction to this would be that I think it's long been there. Yeah, I think it's like now coming up to the surface again. It is in the American Academy as well, to be thinking about, how much of activists should scholars be. But to me, I think that this is a question that is as long as religious studies, exists, as scholars have been activists and have been socially engaged. My second thought about this is, personally, I'm much more comfortable with people who are willing to be forthright about their activism rather than trying to submerge it into the language of kind of objectivity. I tend to think, as this presentation gets at, that there is a normative and performative force behind almost everything we write, and to be able to kind of own that and put it on the table so that other people can examine it and look at it in a more kind of honest way seems to be the clearest way forward to me, to say, well, this is, where I'm coming from. Here's why I'm writing this. That kind of go back to the stakes question that I had earlier, instead of just leaving things at the argument itself. What is the stakes of this argument? So that we can kind of think about those things together. Yeah, but obviously a massive question and really important one. Yeah.
Dr. Meyer, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, I do have some more questions, but I also want to remind our people in the audience to please drop their questions into the Q&A if you have any. Okay, so one thing that I was thinking about as you were giving your presentation is that another thing that these binaries, right, insider, outsider, emic, etic, another thing that they do is that they really kind of perform the roles of gatekeepers in academic writing.
Yeah, totally.
And like the old question, who gets to speak on behalf of Islam, and Islam reified in a particular way, and like the politics on that may shift at particular times, but it is often assumed that only people with an insider perspective, or definitely not people with an insider perspective, can produce any sort of truth worth knowing about Islam. And I'm also wondering about the ways in which this is sort of institutionalized and reified on the academic level through academic disciplines. Like, for example, religious studies does a particular thing and theology does a different thing, maybe. And people can only talk about particular things from within particular fields. Do you think this, I mean, obviously there's some other power dynamics in the background here. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I totally think that the etic or the objective or the outsider position is used as a mode of greater authority. Of course, it sometimes flips. I want to honor that, and I'll mention that in a second. But when I think about, like, why would Muhammad Natsir in the 1950s go to Gibbs' definition at all? Like, why do that? He's writing in Indonesian to fellow Indonesians about the Indonesian constitution. And so then the kind of instinct to go to a British Orientalist, to me, denotes not just within an academic realm that academics have more authority, Western academics, but that even within certain Islamic discursive spheres, that this ability to like yank in someone that is perceived as objective, as an outsider, gives his argument an extra force to it, which I find really fascinating that is happening in the 50s, that this kind of like, obviously very kind of immediately post-colonial moment, that Western scholars have that kind of authority among Muslim thinkers and among Muslim politicians. The other example I think about this kind of authority gap and gatekeeping function is why I think Shahab Ahmed is so intent on using the emic and etic. To me, this might be a function of the fact that, like, to claim the etic makes his book more clearly not a piece of theology, but a piece of theory. And he feels kind of important for him to make that clear time and again. In this way, that seems like this book is so nuanced and so rich in so many ways that he seems to kind of go back and rely on that emic and etic distinction. And to me, it seems like a move, maybe conscious or unconscious, I'm not necessarily sure and don't want to venture which one, to say that this is theory. This is not theology, because theory comes with a kind of, a greater degree of intellectual heft, a greater degree of kind of intellectual authority in at least a lot of spheres, not all spheres, than kind of an idea of theology would. So I definitely think that referring to the etic, the outsider, positioning yourself that way, or bringing outsiders into an insider conversation like Natsir does, increases a sense of authority, and there's also a gatekeeping function of exactly of saying emic work is not theory. It's not, it's a primary source. It's not a secondary source. That is definitely going on. I also think that, at least in the American Academy, theology has shrunken and continues to shrink as having a place in purportedly secular universities and religious studies, and people who are drawing on anthropology and history has continued to kind of grow and kind of have a larger footprint in religion departments. And that being able to claim that outsider or etic position is really beneficial for getting jobs, and kind of the kind of ways that religious studies interacts with other disciplines as well, as, you know, another social, like almost a kind of social science rather than something that is coming from within and making theological arguments. So yeah, and to a large degree, I think that is, to me, that's also interesting, that kind of pushing out of theology is reflected in Natsir and others' desire to kind of quote the outsider, the etic position in Indonesia itself, that it's not just a trend within the kind of Western academy, but that kind of authority differential is actually inflected in a lot of ways in Indonesian Islamic discourse.
Just a brief follow-up on the emic-etic distinction. Have you by any chance looked into the racialization theories? And I know that this is a whole new research, but how would racialization play into labeling some scholars and their scholarship as emic and others as etic? I mean,
I haven't looked into that.
Part of your larger research? No,
I haven't looked into that. Would you have any suggestions of where I would begin?
Not directly, but I think that that possibly the racialization element is crucial in determining one's positionality, right? Especially coming from a specific, obviously, group of people or scholars. In not only in Islamic studies, obviously, but generally in religious studies. So I'm wondering maybe this could be, well, again, it's a whole new research. I mean, it opens up a completely new chapter, but it's something that could be looked at as well from a different angle, obviously.
Interesting. Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah.
You're welcome. Liv, do you have a follow-up, perhaps?
Well, I'm happy to leave the room for Verena, if you have something that you want to. I have a minor question, but it's like, please go ahead, Verena, if you have something else you want to say.
Or we just I just noticed that we have a question in the Q&A.
Yes, please go for that one.
By Mariam Khawar. Hi, Mariam. She asks, hello, thank you for the illuminating talk. With the example of Natsir using Gibbs' definition, I think that it's not simply about using a Western thinker to validate one's own research. I think this is very much about who owns the authoritative spheres of knowledge, specifically in the Western academy. Visibly, Muslim researchers have to convince their peers that they're not just preachers in different robes. That being said, would you speak about any practices or pedagogical shifts that can help remove this prejudice, for the lack of a better word, in the academy? After all, this claim of to the outsider objectivity is really a protective reflex against accusations of bias.
Yeah, totally. So to me, I think in the classroom, it's important to get students to think about where all scholars are coming from. I think the instinct that students have, at least I've witnessed over in the places that I've been teaching, is when you're teaching about Christianity, practicing Christians are more suspect. When you're teaching about Islam, practicing Muslims are more suspect in their authority. Students immediately make that assumption. So I have very much tried to push back by that by getting them to think about where all the scholars that they're reading are coming from, instead of just people who are, openly engaging in kind of any type of normative work. But like everyone is coming from somewhere. Let's take seriously where these various authors that we are reading are all coming from, and put their backgrounds all under the same type of kind of scrutiny that we would for people who are supposedly, as the quote was, preaching. Since, like a lot of people are preaching secularism or preaching other types of values as well. To me, that's pedagogically the move to make. I think scholarly maybe a little bit harder to do that, but I think in the classroom, really kind of like putting that assumption that students have front and center. I've used the example before of, like Americans don't necessarily assume that because you're American and writing a history of the United States, that you should immediately be suspect of that person's insider status. But when they read, a Pakistani who's writing a history of Pakistan, they make this assumption that they're like partisan partisan, but you're like, hello, like every single scholar that you've probably read who has been writing about American history is American. And we don't necessarily, you know, have that, students don't necessarily make that connection that all scholars are coming from somewhere, and we should equally subject people's kind of backgrounds and kind of intentions and what they bring to the study, you know, to that kind of same level of critical analysis. Yeah.
Good point. Do we have another question from Ramadani? Several weeks ago, Majid Danishkar has been invited by University of Kalijaga University to present his book, Studying Quran in Muslim Academy, and he concluded that Indonesia is a good model for future Islamic studies because the academic environment among Indonesian Muslim scholars has been built from cosmopolitan resources, both Western and Eastern. So today they already move from dichotomal bias perspective between insider and outsider. My question is, why don't you discuss about the theoretical debate among Indonesian scholars about the idea of, quote, integration of knowledge and Islamization of knowledge as an example of how contemporary Islamic higher education in Indonesia has been developed?
Yeah, super important. I totally agree. I think that the last, let's say, 40 years or so in Indonesia, there's been a real push to get beyond these kind of Eastern, Western, Islamic, non-Islamic sources, and really kind of think cosmopolitanly or inclusively or holistically about religious studies in a way that I think is largely really pushing back against these distinctions in a much more productive way than often exists in Western academic spheres. So yeah, I think that these kind of moves to integrate Islamic knowledge, especially at the state Islamic universities, is really interesting and really kind of challenging this binary, and in very many ways the inspiration for why I'm interested in challenging these binaries, of watching Indonesian scholars really like lead the way and thinking beyond emic beyond insider outsider, and really doing some what I think of as really creative work that draws from various different sources. I think Gunawan Muhammad to me is a kind of pioneer in many ways in that type of work. His ability to cross discursive traditions, synthesize them, and then popularize them for reading public, I think is amazing in that manner. Yeah, so yeah, totally agree.
Verena, do you have your follow-up question?
Yes, I have another question. First, thank you. This is also interesting. And like I was thinking about how I've been noticing more and more recently how in certain academic settings, for example, at conferences, it's very predictable who is going to be asked to reflect on their positionality, right? Even though, I mean, that's good academic practice and we should all do that, but it's very predictable who's going to be asked for that. I wanted to build on the previous question about sort of the specific case of how all of this has evolved in Indonesia over the last decades. And I'm wondering, do you think, or to what extent do you think is Indonesia unique in this regard? Is this a global phenomenon, or is this perhaps, do these processes become especially visible in Indonesia because they have been politicized at particular moments and therefore they're sort of object of public discussion much more than in other places? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. As someone who specializes in Indonesia, it's often hard for me to make good judgments about how unique Indonesia is in that way. What I tend to think is you can find Muslim intellectuals across the Islamic world, obviously including in the United States and Europe as well, who are doing what I would call cross-discursive work, or kind of integrating insider and outsider perspectives. I think that there is a good argument to be made that it's flourishing to a larger degree in Indonesia because it has gained a foothold in the major state Islamic university system as a really very kind of acceptable, widespread, authoritative way of doing Islamic studies in Indonesia itself that goes back to the 1970s. So it's not seen necessarily as new in Indonesia because you now have 2 generations of scholars who have been publishing and really kind of thinking in this way. But that's not to say that that's not the case also in Pakistan and Egypt to some degree. I think that there are less intense pushbacks against it in Indonesia. There are pushbacks. There are ways of saying that this is a manifestation of colonialism. This is, you know, kind of adopting inauthentic sources into the Islamic tradition, kind of succumbing to Western epistemologies to some degree. I think that those arguments make a lot of sense, but I think that they're also only part of the picture of what's happening in Indonesia. So there are Indonesians who will absolutely critique this kind of integrating, this kind of transgressing the emic-etic divide or bringing in Western scholarship. But I think that because there is such institutional support for doing this type of work in Indonesian universities, and it's rooted and it has governmental support, that it has a momentum at this stage that it might not have the same degree of momentum in certain other kind of Islamic countries. But that doesn't mean that there aren't scholars doing it as well.
Wonderful. We're over the hour, so to speak. So in case there are no other questions, I would like to thank you so much, Professor Abbas, for your talk, for engaging with us, to you, Verena, as well, for the discussion, and to MF CASR, Liv, and Greg for hosting us and for your help. Please continue to follow our events, both on MF's webpage as well as on YouTube. As you know, we will put the recordings online as soon as we edit them. So thank you again for this wonderful discussion and talk, and I hope that we can host you in the future in person as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks.
Absolutely, it was a pleasure. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.